Okay, another definition. Again, there are a lot of definition of terms for PAS 41. Biological transformation, it comprises the process of growth, degeneration, production, and procreation that cause qualitative or quantitative changes in a biological asset. Okay, so if we are in the business of measuring biological transformation class, then that would fall under agricultural activity, and therefore PAS 41 will be applicable. Okay, harvest, I expect students to be able to figure it out even if without having read PAS 41 previously. Harvest is the detachment of produce from a biological asset or the cessation of a biological asset's life processes. If you will now kill your uh, animals class, then that would be considered as a form of harvest. Okay. Paragraph 5a gives us specific examples of what are not bearer plants, and uh, it would make sense. Okay, plants cultivated to be harvested as agricultural produce. Okay, we're talking about trees class, but we are concerned as to how tall it grows because we are going to use it for lumber. The longer it grows, the thicker it develops class, then the more profitable it would be for us. And in that case, it would not be considered as a bearer plant. Plants cultivated to produce agricultural produce when there is more than a remote likelihood that the entity will also harvest and sell the plant as agricultural produce. Okay, so if you have intention of both using the plant class to produce fruits and ultimately use the plant as and harvest the plant as well, then that would not be considered as a bearer plant. Of course, annual crops obviously are not just merely bearer plants because they are somewhat consumable class. Uh, After harvest, then they would also get uh, terminated, or there will no longer be anything that would be left. Okay, paragraph 5b class could be a good source for a true or false question. Will the fact that there will be independent will the fact that there will be incidental scrap sales affect the classification of a plant? The answer is no if the sale is just incidental class and that there's really no intention to manage and monitor the biological transformation, then the plant would be considered as a bearer plant. Okay, so to help you also determine if there is agricultural activity involved and therefore PAS 41 should be applied, okay, you take note of the three uh, features mentioned in paragraph 6: capability to change, management of change, and measurement of change. Obviously, plants and animals class have capability to change, okay? And depending on our intention to manage and measure the change class, the classification of the plant and animals would be different. If we are concerned about the measurement and the management of the change, then definitely it would be considered as a biological asset. Basically, paragraph 7 class is an expansion of the definition provided earlier for biological transformation. The definition provided for carrying amount here is the same definition we've regularly encountered. The same is true for fair value. This is the same definition we've encountered in the other standards. Now, this would be important. The next important thing to remember: recognition and measurement. I think I have already mentioned in passing class as to the uniqueness in the measurement of biological assets. Unlike the other assets we have already discussed, normally the rule on the initial measurement would be different from the rule on for the subsequent measurement. But for agricultural produce class, the rule that is applicable both at the initial measurement and at the subsequent measurement dates would be the same. And the rule is biological assets are to be measured at its fair value less cost to sell. Okay, and because of this rule class, again, I think I have mentioned this in passing before, it's possible that even at the time of initial recognition, on the date of initial recognition, the entity will recognize a loss. It's possible that the entity will recognize a loss even in the date of initial recognition. Why? Because again, biological assets are to be uh, initially measured at fair value less cost to sell. So what do I mean there will be a loss? The biological asset class has a fair value of 5,000. And since it is its fair value class, then that is the price that we would be willing to pay for the asset. Okay, that is the price that we are willing to pay for the biological asset. So we paid 5,000. Normally, if you pay 5,000 class, you would recognize the asset that you get back also at 5,000. That is if the rule was to measure it at cost, because the cost to us is 5,000. But because the rule here is fair value less cost to sell, we would still start at the 5,000 class, but we will have to deduct the estimated cost of selling the asset. So if it's estimated that the cost to sell is 500, you will recognize or record the biological asset at 5,000 class. At 4,500, even though you paid 5,000 for it. So how will your entry look like? You recognize debit biological asset 4,500. You credit cash 5,000. Okay, and the balancing figure will be a loss class in the amount of 500 pesos, representing the difference in the fair value less cost to sell and the amount that you paid for. Okay, but just to emphasize, we are using the 5,000 not really because it is our cost, but because it is also the fair value. Okay, normally at the date of initial recognition class, the fair value and the cost would be the same. The amount that you're willing to pay for the asset would be the fair value on that particular date. There will be a loss because you will be recording it at a reduced amount. Okay, so please take note, this is very unique. How are biological assets initially measured? They are initially measured at fair value less cost to sell. How are they subsequently measured? They are subsequently measured at fair value less cost to sell as well. So the initial recognition measurement is the same as the subsequent measurement for biological assets. If we go over the recognition criteria class, you will still see there probable and measurable. It is probable that the future economic benefits associated with the asset will flow to the entity. And third, the fair value or cost of the asset can be measured reliably. Now you'll notice, why is there an introduction of an additional criteria when most of other assets you've read only involve two, probable and measurable? Why are we emphasizing control here? Just think of fish class. You're engaged in fishing in the open sea class. Since what you would be harvesting class would be fishes from the sea. Would be fish from the sea class. It's important that you have control over this fish class. But because you are fishing or harvesting from the open sea class, you do not have any control over this fish. So it's not correct for you. It's not correct for you to recognize the fish from in the sea class as part of your assets. You cannot claim ownership or right over those assets, over those fish in the sea class. You only have rights over them the moment that you were able to harvest or hunt for them class. The story would be different if we're talking about a fish pond, because if you're the one who placed fish there and you were the one who fed the fish from the fish pond, then definitely the fish there are within your control. But if we're talking about fishes from the open sea class, definitely you do not have that control. And this is very unique for plants and animals class, because there are a lot of instances wherein plants and animals could be available to just about anybody class. So for a plant or animal to be recognized as a biological asset class, as your biological asset, you must have control over these biological assets. Okay, so if you have trees that are not owned by anybody class, then you should not be reporting that as part of your biological assets. Okay, so that would explain as to why there is an additional criteria here, when normally you would have been given with the standard with two criteria only, which would be probable and measurable. Okay, paragraph 13, agricultural produce harvested from an entity's biological assets shall be measured at its fair value less cost to sell at the point of harvest. Okay, it would be recognized at the point of harvest at its fair value less cost to sell, but the moment it is harvested reclassified or transferred from biological assets to inventories, unless another standard is applicable. Here, paragraph 15 opens us to the possibility clause that the determination of the fair value of a biological asset can be achieved when undertaken as a group class or by grouping your biological assets. It might be difficult to determine fair value for a single biological asset. It might be easier for us to determine the fair value when we group certain biological assets. Okay, it says here you can group them according to their age or quality. Although I do not expect paragraph 24 to be a source of question, but at least be familiar, class, as to the instances wherein cost of the biological asset would approximate its fair value. Okay, when little biological transformation has taken place since initial cost incurrence, the impact of biological transformation on price is not expected to be material. Now, we also have an issue as to biological assets class that are attached to the land. Basically, we're talking about plants or trees here, class. There may not be an available fair market value class or fair value for plants alone or for trees alone. However, there may be available fair value for a land that has trees. And that is actually a likely possibility class, wherein the readily available prices would pertain to parcels of land which also contain trees of the same nature as to the one that we are trying to measure, class. So in that case, you do not have to force on having a fair value for your trees, class, but instead you make a reference to the fair value of the land with the same trees as we do, and you just deduct the fair value of the land. And whatever you compare the fair value of the land with trees and the fair value of a land alone. Okay? And of course, if there are improvements, you also take that into account. But assuming we're only dealing with land and the biological asset class. To get the fair value of your biological asset, your trees, you get the fair value of your land you get the fair value of a land with trees, and you get the fair value of a similarly situated land without the trees class. Then the difference would be presumed to be the fair value of the trees that we have.